At Professional Risk Management Services, our medical liability insurance program for psychiatrists and behavioral health group practices, the Psychiatrist Program, is designed to meet your needs throughout the various stages of your career. As a national psychiatry-specific program, a policy with PRMS can cover child and adolescent, forensic, early career, and military psychiatrists, as well as moonlighting residents and fellows, part-time practitioners, and telepsychiatrists. Learn more about how PRMS can protect you.
Welcome to the WPS podcast. My name is Daniel Wesley. I'm one of the residents at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and we're going to speak with Dr. Julia Frank. I'll just introduce her. Dr. Julia Frank graduated from Yale Medical School, where an early interest in the history of psychiatry and public health shaped a lifelong commitment to trauma and recovery. Following residency at Yale, she pursued pioneering work on the treatment of PTSD before holding academic and clinical roles at the University of Texas at Austin and later at George Washington University. At GW, she combined her passions for education, trauma care, and reproductive mental health, developing innovative clinical programs and mentoring future generations of physicians. Dr. Frank, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, yeah. And just to get us started off, if you could just please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you describe your current role.
Well, I guess what's most relevant is that I came to GW in 1993. So I've been around a long time. And in the time that I've been here, I've done many different things, but always with my foot at GW. Currently, I'm an emeritus professor, but I used to be the director of the psychiatry clerkship and medical student education in psychiatry. The disaster psychiatry during 2005, I think, I went to 2008, I think I went to Mississippi with Dr. Catherine May, and Dr. May had done a lot of disaster work in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I went with her, did some of that. I used to be on the disaster committee at the George Washington Hospital, which is a very active group, and for a long time was very active in the whole town. I mean, DBH and Washington Hospital Center and Georgetown were all involved in disaster psychiatry. So currently, being emeritus, I see patients at the MFA, the Medical Faculty Associates, and I continue to precept or run the 5 trimesters clinic for reproductive psychiatry, which is my pride and joy. And I still do refugee evaluations for refugees applying for asylum under the umbrella of Physicians for Human Rights, which has a chapter at GW. And just today I lectured in the medical school for anxiety disorders, still teaching here and there with residents and medical students.
Okay. And I was wondering, since you brought it up, if you could talk a little bit more about what is disaster psychiatry and what your experiences have been in that realm.
It's basically mental health in disasters. I'm on the fence about talking about psychiatry versus talking about mental health, but this is clearly a mental health field because people can be very upset and very symptomatic and look very out of balance, I guess, in the wake of a major event. But you have to know that it typically will resolve with adequate help that doesn't require medication or even a diagnosis. Because USIS is here, the Uniformed Services Health Sciences University, the Army, for obvious reasons, is very active and forward-looking in how can mental health people improve the response to disasters. And disasters is anything that messes up life. So it's war, but it's also natural disasters. It can be major industrial accidents. It's any stressful thing that affects a large group of people. I think that's how it sort of is defined. Anthrax, when it came to DC, it only affected 3 people in the end, but it scared 1,000 and some, more than 1,000 of people, and so it was a disaster. So the first thing that disaster psychiatrists have learned is that you can't do everything for everybody, but you can take care of the people who are first responders. So if you can get to that group, you can extend your understanding and your help by using them or by helping them to help other people. So that's the first thing that I think is important to recognize. Also, it's important to again, there's a famous story my father used to tell about an ophthalmologist who was consulted by a man who had a cinder in his eye, and the ophthalmologist removed the cinder and sent a bill, and the bill was for $100 at that time. That was a lot of money, and the patient came back and said, "This is outrageous. I want an itemized bill. Why did you send me a bill for $100?" And the ophthalmologist wrote, "Removal of cinder from eye, $5. Knowing when to stop, $95." And that's kind of the way I think of disaster psychiatry, is that you need to know what not to do as much as anything. You need to help people regain immediate stability in the world around them, and you need to kind of help them assess how their lives have changed or might need to change after the event. And you need to reconnect them to the disrupted social relations that have been affected by this event. COVID was terrible because it interrupted so much of people's close relationships. So it wasn't a sudden disaster, it was a slow moving disaster, but it had a lot of qualities of disaster. And supporting the responders to COVID was a critical imperative. So that's my understanding of it. But when I was on the disaster preparedness committee at the hospital, the other thing that I offered as a psychiatrist was we provided a lot of materials for first responders. How to take care of yourself after a disaster. Don't drink, talk to somebody, stay hydrated, get enough sleep. Basic stuff, but really important when your mind has just been, shattered by some terrible experience. And then the other thing that I was very concerned about is family members. When people come to the hospital, the family gets shut out, but the hospital is where people whose family members have been impacted by a disaster are likely to show up. And so as a psychiatrist who had something of a family orientation, I made sure that we wrote family support into the hospital disaster plan. That's a nutshell of it. There's lots more to say, of course.
Okay. Well, you mentioned your father, so I wanted to step back a little bit and ask how you initially chose psychiatry, and how you kind of got down this route and how you eventually got into disaster psychiatry.
Okay. Well, my father is a very well-known and highly published and highly respected psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins for most of my life. We moved to Baltimore from Washington the year before I was born, the family, and my father literally stayed at Hopkins until he died, many, 70 years later. So I grew up in an environment where my father talked about his work all the time and made not a whole lot of sense to me when I was young. But over time, when I got to college, for example, I was a social sciences major. We read a lot of Freud in that, and that was an interesting experience. But it wasn't transformative or anything, but it was sort of kept my interest going. And then when I got to medical school, I initially said, I am not going to go into psychiatry. I'm clearly going to go into geriatrics or family medicine or something like that. And then on my rotations, it was obvious that I spoke psychiatry fluently, and I didn't speak much of the rest of medicine fluently. I really, I managed, but I didn't. Didn't come to me, and it didn't grab me, and I didn't feel as excited about, asking questions and trying to understand what I was. So I went, and Yale was a terrific place at that time. I had a wonderful resident, my first psychiatry rotation, who kind of really just was really excited and exciting about it. And he was interested in some of this cross-cultural work, and disasters, of course, are multicultural experiences. They affect it rains on everybody. So I did my psychiatry residency, and I was at the VA when I started. I did my first year of residency entirely at a VA hospital. And you think of the VA as being people with chronic schizophrenia and alcoholism as being the kind of modal patient. But in 1978, when I was there, in addition to it being that, we were beginning to diagnose PTSD using the DSM, which came out in 77, the DSM-3. So all of a sudden, we were asking these very sick or disabled and impaired men about their traumatic experience, and boy, were we hearing it. So we learned a lot about it. There was also a pretty big creative arts therapy thing going on at my VA. And so, taking different ways of looking at it, looking at trauma and responding to it was fascinating. And then there was a research group that invited me to participate in their study of one of the things I like about trauma, aside from the fact that the people who are traumatized are often quite responsive to many mental health interventions. They're intact people in difficult circumstances, and so you can really help a lot. But the thing that got me into trauma in particular was that in the 1980s, early 80s, we're talking about, medication was becoming really available and effective. The Prozac came out actually after my residency, but we had the antidepressants, we had the second generation antipsychotics. But the thing about trauma is that people responded. It was obviously a psychological situation with psychological consequences, but they also responded to medication. It seemed to affect them in a very basic way. And so that the interplay of their psychology and their brain to me was absolutely compelling. And then a friend of mine who was a residency colleague and was headed for a research career invited me to participate in a study they were doing of MAO inhibitors and tricyclic antidepressants in traumatized veterans. So that was really fascinating. And we found indeed that we could help some people. And then I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and for 6 years I was out of academia, but I was evaluating gazillion college students, graduate students, occasionally professional students, and the amount of trauma in their backgrounds was substantial. I mean, the ones that came in for counseling were often, in bad relationships or had come from very disturbed homes, and so it kept my interest going. That was then Prozac came out, and Prozac turns out to have benefits for trauma as well. So I got to be the very, very first sort of cohort of psychiatrists who were able to prescribe Prozac or fluoxetine for everything, including trauma. And then I came to DC and already sort of labeled as a trauma person. And the DC hospital, Ronald Reagan was shot, and he was treated at George Washington University Hospital. It was a disaster for the hospital. I mean, they closed up like a whole wing for 3 months. It was a mess, but it got them into really thinking about responding to severe events like that. And the disaster committee there was run by some excellent people, Joe Barbara and Anthony McIntyre, now Bruno Pettineau. And Bruno is ex-military, but Joe and Anthony were just terrific trauma people, and getting involved with that committee, and as the hospital sort of ramped up and educated itself on how to respond, was very interesting. The other thing that happened was that there was a plane that hit the 14th Street Bridge just before I got to DC. Anne might know when it was. It was maybe in 89, something like that. And those survivors were also treated at GW Hospital. Or there weren't any survivors, I'm sorry, but but as an event, it was a big trauma locally. So that prompted the hospital to really gear up. And then when Reagan, there was also an Institute for Emergency Medicine, and trauma response in hospitals is an emergency medicine thing. So I got really involved in helping write their disaster plan, went to their meetings for years. And then, that kind of when Hurricane Katrina hit, there were 300 poor souls who got on a plane in New Orleans thinking they were headed for Dallas, and they ended up at Dulles. So they were a very traumatized and disoriented group of people. And I had become a Red Cross volunteer, mental health volunteer. So that let me get into where the survivors were being housed and fed, and I was able to, participate in the sort of citywide response to this particular disaster, which was also, every disaster is different, and then they're all the same. People really need and respond to um, genuine and caring help. And so, every time something happens, I've been sort of on the periphery of it. The anthrax scare, which came, I believe, after Hurricane Katrina, again, it freaked a lot of people out. And the hospital had to suddenly gear up and start screening people for anthrax exposure. We literally screened 700 people in 2 days in our emergency room. It was just extraordinary effort. And I got to participate. So, having some experience sort of opens doors, and then you keep going in.
Yeah, you've touched on this already, but you've done great work in disaster psychiatry. I'm wondering, what are you most proud of in your career?
Not that. Um, Although uh, I think what I'm most proud of in my career is uh, writing textbooks. I mean, taking, a very broad knowledge of psychiatry and very broad experience and expressing it in a way that I believe is accessible and useful to younger people. I mean, I really like the work I've done in education. I piloted the use of standardized patients in psychiatric education at GW. I wrote a lot of stuff, and um, I really, and I took everything that I had learned in anything, and I managed to kind of feed it into our clerkship. And for a long time, that was really fun and felt very personal to me. I am, glad of the trauma work that I've done. But the other thing is that it's exhausting and it's disruptive to yourself to be rushing off to Mississippi for, trauma, or to suspend everything and go to the armory for 2 weeks. And I find it somewhat wearing. And so I'm very happy that I've recently been able to go into reproductive psychiatry. That's a field that's grown as I've grown. And I found this clinic. And so we are now providing reproductive mental health services to women who wouldn't have had it before. It's only 150 people a year that we see, but that's 150 people who needed help and couldn't get it, got into it. And I love that work. I mean, I have children. I had a colicky child who, did us all. We cut our teeth on our oldest daughter. I can say she was, even her grandmother said she was a difficult baby. And, being able to take all my personal experience with my children and bring it to bear, and helping residents learn how to take care of mothers and babies and families is just lovely. And all of these people, I mean, all of these things are sort of peripheral to the usual interests of defined mental illness. I like depression. I like manic depression. That's all fine. But these I like demoralization, which is kind of the mental state that's not a disorder, but that which cuts across all of these circumstances. People get overwhelmed, and it's nice to be in a position to steady them and help them.
Oh, yeah, that's very important. Demoralization. I just always like to ask, you've talked about what you're most proud of in your career. What, if any, regrets do you have, and what would you go back and change, or would you want yourself to know when you were younger?
One thing I do regret that I um, never really got up to speed as a researcher. I was so allergic to statistics, and I wasn't terribly excited about basic science. And so I've never, after that first project, which was quite rewarding, I've never been able to find a place to do more of that. And that's exciting work that I can only observe from afar. I don't I go where I can, so I don't think about the things that I'm not doing. I think about the things I've been able to do. I guess I wish I had done been in a part. I mean, I never wanted to do solo private practice. I've always been part of organizations, but as that because of that, I have to do what the organization needs for me to do. And so there have been times when I've really enjoyed being able to practice as part of a team or work with other people in a certain way. And then I work in a department or a organization where you can't do that. So there's things I regret about, any particular place that I've worked. It's not much of an answer, actually. Um, but
Living with no regrets is good too.
yeah. I
Pretty
mean,
good.
I could have gone to Johns Hopkins 3 times in my life. And but every time I applied to medical school, residency, and then after residency, every time I interviewed at Johns Hopkins, I'd run into my father, I'd run into my mother who had become a therapist. And I said, no, I just can't do this. But Hopkins is a fabulous place. And I guess I do regret that I didn't necessarily take advantage of the depth and breadth of what was available locally.
We are coming toward the end of our time already, but I wanted to ask if you could share a piece of mentorship advice that you received that you think might be helpful for other, up and coming psychiatrists, and if you had anything else that you wanted to share that you thought was worth mentioning, I would love to give you a chance to do that.
I guess the mentorship is something that Bob Davies, who was my first ward chief, said to us, which is that you think you know what you're going to do after residency, but you have no idea. That you really have to recognize that there are many things that you haven't yet learned and that you could learn. And so you should really and be open to the possibilities of doing things that you hadn't expected. And that I think is certainly true. I after residency, I had no idea that I was going to go to work in the VA, for example. That was never on my menu. It turned out to be an excellent experience. I didn't know I work in student health, and that turned out to be an excellent experience. So, you know, that's another one of my father's phrases. He talked about people who were in the Gulf Stream and a boat went by and people in it were dying of thirst. And the people in the boat next to them said, let down a bucket where you are because you're actually in a freshwater storm. And that's kind of been my motto is, wherever you go, make the best of it. Let down the bucket where you are and see what there is. So, you know, and also, I mean, just don't get totally blinded by the minutiae of life. That, what's going on and understanding human behavior and understanding the nervous system and how it all fits together and how we uh, relate to, other people who are in the helping professions. That's all growing and growing and growing, even under current difficult organizational circumstances. So you shouldn't lose your joy and your fascination with some of the basic questions that we get to ask.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Frank. And at this point, I want to open up to people in the audience to ask any questions. And Dr. Dietrich, go ahead and feel free and everyone to post in the chat or just raise your hand.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Julia,
No, please go ahead, Dr. Dietrich.
That was such an interesting recap of your career. I had no idea that you were on the cutting edge of PTSD.
It was, and for many years, I to go to the meetings in Baltimore, the ISTSS, and the people that I met when I was doing research were even more on the cutting edge than I was. Dennis Charney was a residency colleague of mine. Tom Costin was the guy who got me into it. I kept in touch with the people at Yale who were doing it. So I kept up with that field for quite a long time. Not so much lately, but really it was very big in my life. And still with the refugee work, it's still, part of me. I guess I have to say one other thing I regret is I never traveled with psychiatry. I never did anything abroad professionally, and I would have liked to see it in another country and participate in another country. And trauma can take you lots of places, but I stayed.
It's quite a change for you to be in reproductive psychiatry after trauma psychiatry, but I like your description of working with people who are demoralized, not psychotic, Not depressed, not, just demoralized.
Well, that's a very borrowed idea. That was my father's point. My father was the theoretician of psychotherapy. What is psychotherapy? How does psychotherapy work? Does psychotherapy work? And then he came to the realization that if most psychotherapies are more alike than different, they must all be treating the same thing. And what he said was that what they're treating is demoralization, which is not that demoralization can exist on its own in people who really aren't mentally ill in the way we understand it, or it can be part of mental illness. I mean, if you have schizophrenia and you can't put your life together and everybody looks at you as someone who is damaged and hopeless, it's very difficult to develop positive sense of self, a hopeful view of the world. And psychotherapy can do that no matter how, you know, there is something going on. There's clearly something that's not right in your biology or your brain, but you are still a person and you can support the person as a psychotherapist, even when you're trying to help them with the illness.
How have you maintained your own hope while treating those with demoralization?
Well, I've protected myself a little bit by not working in really bad disaster situations. That's part of it. So the people that I see, um, their circumstances are not so overwhelming. I mean, they're demoralized and they're upset, but there are still reasons to be hopeful on their behalf. Because people do get better, and if you can follow people over time, that's another thing that I haven't said, but I've had the luxury. I've been here now 30 years. I have patients I've seen for 20 years or so forth. And if you can follow people over time, even, though you may see them through sickness or great struggle, um, the long view is that things can get better. And so that keeps me going, I guess. And I think it's very unfortunate in residency that you see people at the absolute bottom of their cycle of life when you see them in the hospital, and you rarely get to see them for more than a few months afterwards. And so you can't appreciate sort of the capacity people have to recover over time. And also, I read, like, for example, for a while I was interested in borderline personality as a trauma response. And I read about it and I discovered that even though we look at it as a hopeless, long-standing, everywhere in the person's life, always been there, never going to get better, in fact, the empirical research is you take people who are diagnosed as borderline in the beginning, time one, you follow them, and over 5 or 6 years, many of them are no longer borderline. You have to read to kind of look for the hope when you're faced with somebody who's currently in a big mess.
Dr. Cox, I saw you had a question.
Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. Frank. I really appreciate your involvement with the podcasts and learning more about you and your career. I've got to tell you, I wished you had gone to Johns Hopkins as well. As a person who's been at Johns Hopkins for a long time and have incredibly benefited from the Franks during my time at Hopkins. I would have loved to have had you within our department. I've got to tell you that when I was applying to medical school as a fourth-year medical student at Hopkins, I'm applying to residencies. I'll never forget that I got a tough question from my Harvard interviewer for the Mass General residency program at the time, and he asked me if I were on an island and I could only take 2 books on psychiatry with me, what books would they be? And being Hopkins, soon to be Hopkins graduate, I rightfully said The Perspectives of Psychiatry as well as Persuasion and Healing. It's interesting when students now ask me, what should I read to learn more about psychiatry? I tell them those 2 books, The Perspective of Psychiatry and Persuasion and Healing. And I just can't thank you enough, too, for continuing the tradition that you all have created with Persuasion and Healing, which I really do feel is the quintessential and most essential book that every resident should read as part of their experience on how to become a therapist and a good psychotherapist. And so I just wanted to tell you, I certainly think that I consider that to be one of your huge accomplishments and one of the best things that I turn to this day to try to help future psychiatrists in their journey.
Thank you so much for that. I didn't realize you were a Hopkins guy. The fourth edition is just recently come out. I just helped somebody else together. We went through the first three editions and kind of upgraded it without making any deep changes. I'm thinking about my father is sort of like Darwin. He created a framework for how psychotherapies evolve and relate to each other and so forth. And so if you really want to understand the tree and what it looks like, you got to go back to the trunk. So I thank you. I think it's still a very important book too, even though it has some it feels a little bit dated, but it's not, at least not in my view. So thank you so much for talking about it. And the perspectives is interesting. One of the reasons I didn't go to Hopkins is because my father got along very well with Paul McHugh and admired him and so forth. I've had trouble with that, and the perspectives to me is a good heuristic, but it doesn't put things together in a way that I've come to do, thinking about evolution and how things sort of, behavior and thought and instead of dividing those things into buckets, behavioral disorders, psychological disorders, major illnesses, and I forget what the fourth perspective is. I think that they sort of a braid that intertwines in a way that book hints at, but doesn't put it together in the way that I've learned to put it together for myself.
And I think that your comments about demoralization, is the link in so many ways among those different perspectives. And as we all know, unfortunately, is not a billable code and so something that we rarely see on any ultimate list of diagnoses, but is probably the thing that we deal with the most and need to be the most adept at being able to help with.
I would agree.
We have time for one
Thank
more
you again
question.
for your comment.
What do you see yourself doing for the next 10 years, Julia?
Oh my goodness. Well, chasing grandchildren they've come to me late in life, and I'm thrilled about that. I have some projects I really want to get into print. My interest in the history of medicine and psychiatry I still do it. And I have just written a paper about what I call the institutional metaphors and how they structure identity as a medical person, whether we think that we're university discipline or practical discipline or species of warfare or species of business. These are all metaphors that shape professional organizations and professional identity. And I've written this long paper that I've worked on a lot. I'd like to get it published. I have a couple of other things. I want to revise my medical school thesis and get Leona Baumgartner out there in print, because I feel this obligation to her that I never published it. So I'll do that. And I'd like to, I wish I was a way that I could expand the pregnancy perinatal clinic, because it's a very interesting field. Again, it's a very psychobiological field and so forth. And we're kind of constrained by our institutional setting, but I wish there was some way to expand on that. So that's a professional goal. And, there's lots of places I haven't traveled to. And my husband is getting close to retirement, so we might be able to, get around a little bit.
I don't know that you're going to have time to travel with those other projects.
Oh, well. People in my family live long lives. So.
I'll just say that it's kind of nice to have things to look forward to, Julia. And you and I are certainly from the same era and
Yes.
with a long attachment to GW. And I find this is a great time in life for me. And I even have the thoughts of sometimes the best years are still ahead of me in my late 70s. And it's just tremendous to have things that we're interested in and things that we still want to do and will always want to do for as long as we're alive. Yeah.
I think that you're editing Capital Psychiatry is a great, great thing. I must say it's still, bright light in the field. But as psychiatry is an old man's game. There's a lot of medicine where you get really, really out of date, but the longer you live, the more you understand about people, and that's kind of nice.
You're much better as an older person in terms of being a psychiatrist.
Yeah. I think so. I try to look at both ends of the spectrum, telling patients that younger psychiatrists that are just starting out know the latest and the greatest.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, we have hopefully wisdom on our side that we've accumulated. So there's a place for both. Yeah.
We expect Daniel to tell us everything what's new and great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should be so lucky. On that note, I think we were going to call it here. Thank you so much, Dr. Frank, for joining us on the WPS podcast. And we'll be here next month, the last Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. for the next one.
Thank you again for having me.